Hi to everyone. So we're just waiting for everyone to make their way in through the lobby into the meeting, and then we will make a start. Give it a few more minutes and then make a start. I can see everyone is making their way through. If we just give it another 30 seconds and then we'll kick off. Just to do some housekeeping. That should give people a bit more time to come in as well. Right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I think we're still getting a few people coming through the lobby, so I'll just kick things off with some housekeeping from my perspective before handing over to the speakers we've got here. So for those that don't know me, my name is Joe Shaw, a Senior Market Services Executive at the IUA. We're delighted today to be putting on another IUA market briefing. We've got Suki Bassi here, who is Managing Director and Founder of Russell Group Limited, who's very kindly agreed to come in and speak to us on geopolitical connected risk. And we've also got his colleagues, Manveer and Chris, who will be joining us for the Q&A session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Suki, and he will kick things off.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Afternoon all. Delighted to be presenting here today at the IUA. So if I just move on to the next slide. So I've been given the topic of talking to you about connected risk today, and there is a strong geopolitical element to it. But I think I'd like to begin by essentially looking at the context and definition of connected risk as we see it. Pretty much from the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 90s, business has become more and more global, and what that's led to, I guess, all the leading up all the way up to the pandemic, is that we had a growth in the amount of business relationships globally, and not just growth in the numbers, but the growth in the complexity. If you just see the journey of items from different parts of the world to our trolleys in the supermarkets, you can see the extent of this connectivity. So when an event such as the pandemic or any trade disruption happens, it affects us all. And this is what we mean by connected risk. The interconnectivity of trade, whether that's actually via relationship or physically at a location, affects more than just the locality. And really, it has been our belief for almost a decade that this type of connectivity was building up, and really the understanding of this is key if we're ever going to sort of move to a more sustainable and successful mode of operation. So to begin with, let's just sort of kind of layer up how this sort of kind of works in the global economy. So this slide is essentially the connected economy, and this works from a goods perspective, but also from a service provider perspective, and equally from finance. Insurance companies similarly operate in this way, because most operations are globally operated and located, and they work with suppliers or security that's globally operated and located, and they target and service customers or clients that are located globally, and so their peers. So when we have events, wherever they affect us equally the same. And this has been sort of demonstrated, you know, whether we talk about the pandemic or events post-pandemic. And really the first airing of this was quite possibly during Brexit, because trade risk and exposure is truly borderless, and it isn't just affected at a location through the relationships that we have, some of which are totally intangible. We see the effect direct and indirect at a location. And what this, I guess, cocktail of interconnected risk gives is a rise in exposure, whether it's through goods or services for companies, whether they are manufacturing companies or finance companies. The issue is the same. The exposure are on the rise, and it's aggregating in the risk stacks. And reinsurers will be seeing this, banks are seeing this, and we operate a group of 29 corporates on a project that's been going for 4 years, and they've been seeing it within their risk stacks. And the underlying landscape has become more complex, and really the insurance participation in that risk stack is gradually decreasing rather than increasing, even though the values of products may be increasing post-pandemic as the market's been hardening. The actual percentage of the stack which those products cover is actually on the decline. So what we see is essentially less and less of certainly the corporate risk stack being transferred, and more of it either being financed or pushed through captives. But of course, from the insurance perspective, the value chain sees less and less of this connected risk as you go from insurance to reinsurance and retrocession. The detail of the underlying risk is completely repackaged and to some extent forgotten about. Now, there have been initiatives of late through Lloyd's and through the company market and through individual institutions themselves to kind of get a closer representation of the customer and its risk profile and its trading profile. But nonetheless, this has led to a fragmented view within the marketplace, one of which, if we're trying to move to a more sustainable mode of operation, we really do need to get closer to and address. So the connected risk trail, as we see it, just go back and focus on that a little. I've touched on the pandemic period, but during the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, we were seeing supply chain disruption. And we first noticed the supply chain disruption, Thai floods in 2012, when there were there was the incident in Japan, and then the Thai floods that led on that essentially took out Japanese secondary or backup manufacturing sites. But this has been well disrupted during the pandemic, and even more so with certainly with the flow of foods as a consequence of Russia, Ukraine, and then more recently the threat of China and Taiwan is causing concern over certain parts of the semiconductor industries and high-tech manufactured goods. And at the same time as we've looking at the China-Taiwan, there is talk in Wall Street of deglobalisation, just as China talks about the one China policy. I guess Wall Street is talking about the opposite, the deglobalisation effect. But I guess the one disruptor in amongst all of this is actually digitalisation, because if we want to move to a digitized society, then really we have to address all the disruptive effects of getting there. And one of the key concerns there really is that more and more so now, the effect of this connected risk on business exposure needs to be understood much better and much more clearly than before. I want to touch on a couple of examples. So I've framed them old world, new world. One is Ukraine, Russia, which happened last year. Now, I don't know how much of this is known within the room, but outside of Norway, Ukraine, or outside of Norway and Russia, Ukraine has the next biggest gas reserves. And obviously being very close to the EU did pose a threat to Russia. Not to say that commodities was the only reason that particular conflict started, but there's been plenty of data points throughout history where conflicts and invasions have happened over commodities. Similarly, China, Taiwan, there is a $250 billion trade imbalance between China and Taiwan in Taiwan's favor, purely on integrated circuit boards as a key commodity to the advancing Chinese economy. This is obviously key to them. So arguably, these two particular scenarios are very similarly matched, albeit one being traditional commodity and the other being the newer commodity, so to say. So delving into Russia, Ukraine, now the figures here are all at the start of the conflict. And these are particular examples that could play out again in the China-Taiwan scenario if that did develop in the same way. But certainly there are significant trapped assets still in Russia, so aircraft fleets, as well as funds and monies from Western companies. And at the same time, there's equally Russian assets, being physical yachts and aircraft in the West, and frozen accounts as well in the West, with the net effect of this probably balancing out. Russia was obviously a key supplier to the EU, so obviously its trade, arguably at the time of the start of the conflict, would have been affected, and that's obviously playing out in the sense that certainly for the first year it wasn't, and now certainly the EU has looked at other sourcing routes for its supply of gas. But I guess the key thing is really the impact of commodities, which haven't really retrenched in price, and the effects on oil price, gas prices, which are only just starting to get back to pre-conflict levels. And then I guess the more recent effect of the cost of living globally that this particular conflict has created. Now, flicking to the opposite China-Taiwan scenario, there are a few examples here. I'm not going to list them all. Obviously, there's a lot of time that I need to go through the slides today, but I'm going to pick on a few of them. First off, Apple relies quite heavily on China for its production of iPhones, and there is a value chain slide that's coming that kind of demonstrates that. I guess that the one aspect is where the resources for China, in terms of energy, come from. We've picked up on Angola only because pretty much all of Angola's crude oil goes to China. And then if we look at ores for the sort of smelting processes and the production of steel and iron, etc., most of the iron ore did come from Australia, and also in terms of imports of food products, soybean, that's pretty much all coming from Brazil and the USA. As I suppose if there were any disruption on Chinese trade, there are a lot of countries that would be affected by that. Nonetheless, in terms of this slide, Angola is a key supplier to China, and Brazil is the biggest trading partner is actually China, not the US. But there are other factors as well. We picked up on the trade flows. There is a single point of failure of trade from Western Europe to East and vice versa through the Strait of Malacca. Any trade flow that kind of circumvents this adds more disruption to the trade flows. And there is $3.4 trillion or 15% of global trade that actually sort of flows through that particular channel. But I did cite the integrated circuit boards or semiconductor value chain or processing flow earlier. And this is one graphic that we picked up that kind of demonstrates, I suppose, farm to fork, to quote Boris Johnson, for the semiconductors. So the design is pretty much US and Europe led. The equipment that's required for it is again US, Europe led, and also influenced quite a lot by Japan. But then the silicon then arrives into essentially two key hubs, one Japan, one South Korea, and then that's then passed along to two other countries, Taiwan and Malaysia, which are key manufacturing sites for the semiconductors. Taiwan, more at the high end, military, precision and computing, Malaysia, more general. And certainly China is a key consumer of these products. Certainly for the production of smartphones. And also China has its own industries looking to move up the value chain. So they would like all of this particular value chain being designed, manufactured and processed in China. So this gives you an illustration of the companies within that particular value chain. Some of which names, well, pretty much most of the names on this list are common, but really, I guess that the key one here really is the car industry that really did get disrupted during the pandemic with the flow of goods, and there is a recent article or Lloyd's publication, Loose Connections, with Willis Towers Watson, that was produced, that cited really the huge growth in semiconductors in vehicles. So 8,000 semiconductors in a car, in an electric vehicle at the moment, compares with 10 from the 1970s. So that's a phenomenal rise as to how, I guess, robotic and electronic these vehicles have become, and this is by no means restricted just to that particular industry. All industries, whether it's shipping, aviation, or following a similar path. So at the moment, the semiconductor industry is about 2.5% of global GDP. That can only really grow, and I see a true correlation between this industry and digitalization, only because the high-end computing aspect is very much dependent on this industry too. So what does this mean? I guess that the industry needs a better oversight of this. So we need to not just quantify but qualify the connected risks as to the elements that are relevant to the industry. So, Lloyd's have done quite a bit of work. There has been quite a lot of publications have come out of the WF, and some major carriers in Europe have been involved in trying to really understand the cross-connecting scenarios and get more understanding of how they may affect and impact on portfolios. But one thing's true, from a reinsurance and risk transfer or risk financing protection perspective, understanding this is key to balance sheet protection in the future. So I guess this is the slide that's going to build up. I'm going to flick it a few times just so that we can build up the piece of this, because I talked too quick. Right, so the first thing is that the forces or the pestle forces are known, right? So they're listed there. I'm not going to list them all, but in our view, forces lead to global threats, and global threats generate scenarios. Scenarios trigger events, and events lead to outcomes. That's nice and straightforward. The reason why we say it this way is that in between the events and the outcome comes really the I guess the mapping of the peril. But prior to that, there's one extra step that certainly in the work that we've been doing, that we've generated circularity between threats and events. So we know this to be true only because you can see it in the, if you look at the One China example, that's really the unification of Taiwan. At the same time, there is an equal and opposite deglobalisation threat that's actually emerging, which is actually the responsive mechanism to which has been couched in the US as a move away from China or de-Chinification. So we know these things to be true, and this circularity is quite often lost in our thinking. And I think when we come to do future scenarios, we really need to sort of understand this more deeper, because I think without this, we won't really get to a understanding more sustainable outcomes. And really, it's those that enable us to build up a more joined up approach to exposure analysis, which I see not only driving the insurance and reinsurance side, but I actually also see driving the needs within the corporate as well. So I see this joined up throughout the value chain, from the original risk throughout the insurance, reinsurance, and finance industry. So this will apply, as I said, to both. And from our perspective, since the presentation is talking about the rise of the need to understand connected risk, this is what we see is the realm of the scenario factory. The deeper understanding of threat, scenario, event, the circularity of that relationship, and actually how that then interacts with the whether they're insurable outcomes or non-insurable outcomes is a byproduct. I think that is key to understand. And certainly this is something that we're seeing as a trend, certainly in the RDS work that Lloyd's doing. But what has been the driver to this really is through the work that we've been doing with our corporate risk group. And really what they've been saying is, to them, the pandemic has demonstrated that business interruption is a key thing. And really there are many different ways into business interruption. And this graphic here kind of shows the work that we've done, and actually what we see is the key threat vectors into business interruption. So leading from the top, key infrastructure is either loss or access to physical infrastructure. The default or the credit risk can lead to a business interruption. Failure to supply, legal in the form of sanctions, can lead to business interruption. Loss of supply on the supply side can lead to business interruption. Volatile markets on the back of geopolitical risk can lead to business interruption, and that a lot of that was demonstrated during the pandemic, or all aspects of this were demonstrated during the pandemic. And then lastly, the loss or access to IP and data, also in the form of intellectual property, can lead to business interruption. So I think that when we're looking at business interruption, it's this holistic viewpoint is really necessary. And I think that the scenarios that we're trying to describe an entity with need to have this flavor when it comes to deeply understanding the business interruption and the outcome from it. So leading on to an example, we've touched on One China. I've also positioned deglobalisation as an equal and opposite threat, all on the back of a geopolitical pestle force. So first off, we list out the scenarios in terms of effects on trading hubs, defaults as a result of trade disruption, CBI in terms of failure to supply, sanctions to prevent trade to certain countries, and all of this has been demonstrated in the last 2-3 years. So not as though I'm making these up. These have all happened. Loss of supply. So this an example of this was to the car industry during the pandemic. And I suppose the geopolitical, warmongering does lead to conflict and eventual war, and that does disrupt trade and cause business interruption, and leads to market volatility, which eventually ends up either disrupting supply or costing supply. And then lastly, intellectual property is quite often lost during conflicts. So the examples of the events, they can lead from disruption at ports or airports, infrastructure, key infrastructure, targeted or accidental, civil unrest. During the pandemic, certainly after the Russia-Ukraine, SRCC was almost sort of hyped out as a key area of focus. And nonetheless, that is one key rising threat on the back of political risk. Defaulting of companies, disruption within industries such as automaking or technology manufacturing, whether that's computer manufacture or smartphone manufacture or any ancillary products within that particular value chain, likely to be disrupted. And then I guess that the legal recourse in terms of sanctions on Chinese companies, or quite opposite, sanctions on US companies is obviously prevalent. And then the widespread effects of this in terms of CBI into the wider community, the contagion of disrupted trade on the rest of the supplying or carrying world. And no doubt, whenever there is a conflict, as demonstrated during the original Ukraine conflict of 2017, cyber attacks did rise at that time, and no doubt there is a strong, if you go back certainly over the last 10 years where there has been conflict, there has been spikes in cyber activity. So it creates a cocktail of scenarios and events, all of which I think we need to see have a better understanding of the outcomes over. Why? Because essentially, we have multiple classes being affected in different ways. So if we don't see the full picture, all we're ever going to see is the exposure through the lens of one of these particular lines of business. I'm not going to list them all, but the key ones, besides the sort of traditional transportation and political risk lines are, the standalone BI and non-damaged BI to international property that gets affected, and also personal accident and D&O, where I guess that companies end up having a disruption, and the effects on that business could feed into cases against companies. We do quite a bit of work with advisors, so we've seen the effect of certainly the disruption over the last 3 years, but also some of the other issues of the prior 10. So there is a strong correlation between global events and cases, and that's kind of filtering through in the data that we receive. We do also work with S&P and Moody's, and some of their data also shows similar trends. From the outset, when we started the work with the corporates 4 years ago, their desire was to get a better understanding of the risk profiles that they were they were subjected to, only because that they knew that the landscape was becoming more and more interconnected and complex. So they saw the peril coverage as actually only covering part of the risk profile, not more of it. And in their viewpoint, what they would like to see is a more outcome-based focus that essentially understands the effects of connected risk better. And that obviously needs a much more integrated data set that kind of mimics the risk profiles and the threats more and more in near time, ultimately in real time, so that they can use that to build a holistic view of the threats that they're facing. Why? Because what they've told us, and I highlighted earlier, the risk stack is increasingly less covered by insurance, which ultimately feeds, through the preventative measures that they're taking through a combination of insurance and captive use and risk financing. What they're saying is that some of the risk is retained, and that actually is affecting the ability to take risk, because obviously the tolerance levels are being exceeded. So in their view, if there were solutions out there that could understand the outcome better, that would help rebalance the tolerance and enable the appetite for more risk taking in exchange for risk transfer to carriers over a more relationship based. So this isn't a price driven thing. This is more a collaborative product. And as I mentioned earlier, there is 29 risk managers we're working with, some of which are actually come to the market and may already be speaking to some of the people in the audience today. So what we see is greater collaboration, essentially moving away from traditional silos, not totally, but certainly the ability to think outside of the traditional silos, so we can be a little more imaginative and creative to protect balance sheets. And in their view, they see that coming through a more outcome-based focus. And that is all I wanted to say today.
Well, thanks very much, Suki. So I think we've got plenty of time for questions, which we did want to allocate at the end there. And as we mentioned earlier, you've got your colleagues, Manveer and Chris, on the call as well to help answer those. So if anyone does have any further questions they haven't already put into the Q&A facility, please put those across. Got plenty of time to go through. So I'll hand back to you, Suki, and your colleagues, because I know you've got access to the questions as well. And then we'll kick off some Q&A.
Right, okay. I think, unless I'm mistaken, I don't actually see any questions, which is great because it'll be a short presentation. In which case, Chris, you're always good with questions. Do you want to ask one?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things that I was attending this morning was the advising conference that you mentioned, actually, and it kind of reinforced some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of not so much on the semiconductor side, but he was talking about how lithium sort of batteries are the new a new commodity, a new version of the old world commodity. So they're the new oil. And it's how that any disruption to those kind of those commodities, they could sort of stimulate the kind of disruption that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And so I suppose, I mean, how much work have you? I think I saw we did a report recently on Congo and cobalt, wasn't it? So is it possible to get down to a granular level in terms of looking at commodities throughout those sorts of value chains, and how much work is being done on those that you're aware of?
Well, certainly we use trade data. Trade data is something that we've been using for many years, and because we see trade as a good proxy for past and future exposure flow. So obviously claims is also very good, but it's more backward looking. So the best correlation from our perspective is actually trade. So that's why we've been using it. And yeah, I mean, it's broken down to, each and every commodity, right? So, whether it's apples, oranges, or as you say, lithium, that would be covered, and even batteries. So that doesn't actually concern me. I guess what does concern me is, the intangible aspect, really. So, there's been a lot of focus, even in the slides that we've shown today, about tangible objects. So it's probably best if I start talking about a use case outside of what was talked about today, and that is the project that we have at the moment with a major syndicate, and they came to us in Monte Carlo last year, and their concern was across the portfolio blind spots and lack of data on 3 threats that they described as cyber, political risk, and CBI. And really, if you look at those 3, there are a number of data sets that when fused together gives you a holistic representation of that threat flow, which can then be applied to the business portfolio. But of course, then what we're looking at is the definition of the coverage, right? Which is what I see as quite possibly the biggest hurdle in all the work that we're doing, is the ability for the industry to capture the triggers, right? The triggers on a limit, right? What is precisely covered, what isn't, when is it time dependent or whatever. And I think that whether that's captured in the industry blueprint as better data capture, I think that that is going to be key, right, in everything that we're doing. So gradually, the playbook of events is helping us understand the extent of globalization, or deglobalization as we call it, whichever one of those we end up with. That playbook is making us used to finding the need to understand data better, but in the end, if we don't capture it, then we're not going to be as responsive as we could be.
Okay, and we've got a question here, an anonymous question, where it says, you talk about outcome-based risk transfer. In your experience, how has the market reacted to this need?
Well, I think that stop loss products, I suppose captive reinsurance, I suppose they're the nearest to outcome, right? Some vanilla products that sit behind shock absorbing the risk volatility. So there's been plenty of talk of cell structures or reinsurance around captives, virtual captives, risk financing. I think all of these are examples of outcome-based product. And of course, what we are talking about is an outcome-based product that could always be almost like a top and drop, working with existing insurance placements to act in the primary as a shock absorber, which I guess that the banking industry might have been used to dealing with in the past.
Another question, you mentioned the working group. I mean, how many members do you have are in this working group, and how often do they engage with carriers in the insurance market? Is that something that happens fairly regularly? Right.
Okay. So there's 29. I think I did mention that. So there's 29, and it covers literally farm to fork. We've got a couple of banks. We've got a multitude of manufacturers, people in transportation, mining, all sorts. And we meet with them as a grouping between 2 and 3 times a year. But we've also met, in separate groupings where we've taken one or two of them that have got specific needs and matched them with carriers, where the carriers have described how they can help. And some of those conversations are leading to solutions that may become transactable shortly. So we haven't got a transacted solution on our approach yet, where it's been started by our conversations with us, but we're very close to it.
There's no more anonymous questions for now, so I think that pretty much covers all. But you might want to move on to the next slide. I think there's something on there which we talk about an event that's coming up.
Yeah, sorry, I knew there was something for you. Yeah, so yeah, you can. So I don't know whether these slides are going to be shared, but we do quite a lot of thought leadership, so you can follow us on that link there, and also we have a panel session with a couple of risk managers. So Google and Centrica have signed up on that event, and we're waiting for confirmation from two within the insurance market, but they will be communicated shortly. And that's at the old library at Lloyd's on the 7th of June. So it's a morning panel session. And again, what we're talking about there really is how a connected risk outcome-based solution would work for a carrier. I think quite excited by that.
We actually talked to one of the keynote speakers for that event on the 7th of June, and we're just waiting for confirmation on a potential date for that. So, but that would be a great coup for our panel. And in terms of
I was just going to say, if I could ask myself a question, right? With the lack of questioning. So where is this all going? I guess that when we started as a company, we actually essentially did the modeling for the Lloyd's project in 1994-95. That essentially saved Lloyd's. We've essentially been trailing through the specialty classes ever since. We see an opportunity, having started in the retrocession market in the late 90s, we see a quantification between risk, the risk manager in the corporate and the insurance industry, greater quantification, which will lead to, I suppose, better insights for all, but actually also create the data and analytics for newer products, whether they're outcome-based or enhanced peril-based products. It doesn't really matter. But the idea really is that this creates better data throughout the value chain and also gives more insight to the originator of the risk.
Okay, well, if we haven't got any further questions, then just to note that the slides will be circulated around, because I know you've got a few links in there which everyone will have access to. And the recording of this event will be made available on the IUA YouTube channel. If we've got no further questions coming through, then I just want to say, well, firstly, thank you to Chris for jumping in at the end and helping out with some of the questions there. And just to say thank you to Suki for taking us through that very interesting and informative presentation, which I think has certainly got me thinking on a number of different aspects there. Certainly those familiar with the IUA committee structure will have recognised we have committees for all of those different areas. So lots to think about there. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining today.
Thank you,
Cheers.
Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.